At 6:18 p.m. on December 23, Buckingham Palace released a statement from King Charles that stopped the nation mid-preparation for Christmas. The medical review completed that afternoon had revealed results his physicians had hoped to avoid. What the king confirmed would fundamentally alter the final years of his reign in ways no one had anticipated. The statement that silenced Christmas Eve. The statement appeared not through the usual palace communication channels, but directly from the king's private office, a detail that immediately signaled its personal significance. Staff preparing for the royal family's traditional Christmas Eve departure to Sandringham paused as the notification reached their phones. Journalists wrapping up before the holiday break scrambled back to their desks. And across Britain, families in the midst of final Christmas preparations stopped what they were doing as news alerts flashed across their screens. Following a comprehensive medical review completed this afternoon, the king's statement began. I must inform the nation that my condition, while being actively treated, has progressed in ways that require me to adjust both my treatment approach and my public duties going forward. The words hit with devastating clarity. Charles was not recovering as hoped. The cancer diagnosis he had shared publicly in February 2024, which he had assured the nation was being successfully managed, had taken a turn his physicians had worked quietly through the autumn to address. But the latest review conducted by his oncology team at a London hospital that afternoon had confirmed what Charles had privately begun to accept over recent weeks. The disease was not retreating. It was adapting, resisting, requiring interventions that would fundamentally change what the final years of his reign would look like. The statement continued with a level of medical candor that shattered decades of royal protocol around health privacy. My physicians have recommended a more aggressive course of treatment which I have chosen to pursue. This treatment will allow me to continue in my role as king but will require modifications to my schedule and responsibilities as side effects will at times limit my capacity. The British public settling in for what should have been a peaceful Christmas Eve absorbed the news with collective shock. Within minutes the BBC had interrupted its regular programming. Sky News brought in medical experts and constitutional historians, and across social media, the mood shifted from holiday cheer to somber reflection on what the king's words actually meant. For those who understood the careful language of palace communications, the implications were clear. Charles was preparing the nation for a visible decline. He was acknowledging that his time as a fully functioning monarch was measured not in decades but in years. And he was doing something unprecedented, managing his own succession while still alive. Transparent about his mortality in a way British monarchs had never been. In the United States, where it was early afternoon, cable networks cut into their pre-Christmas coverage with breaking news banners. King Charles reveals cancer has progressed. British monarch announces adjusted prognosis. The American reaction was immediate sympathy mixed with fascination at the constitutional implications. How would the monarchy manage a gradual transition? What did this mean for Prince William? And how long did Charles actually have? By 7:00 p.m., Buckingham Palace had issued a brief supplementary statement confirming that the king would proceed with the royal family's Christmas plans at Sandringham and that further details about his adjusted schedule would be released in the new year. But the questions that statement left unanswered were the ones that would dominate coverage through the holiday and beyond. The health crisis hidden in plain sight. To understand what forced Charles to release such a devastating statement on the eve of Christmas, it is necessary to return to February 2024 when he first publicly acknowledged his cancer diagnosis. The announcement at the time had been carefully calibrated, informing the public of the diagnosis while assuring them that treatment had begun promptly and that the prognosis was positive. What the public had not been told because palace protocol and Charles's own privacy preferences prevented it was the specific type of cancer he was battling or the statistical realities of its typical progression. The palace had confirmed only that it was not prostate cancer discovered during a procedure for benign prostate enlargement and that Charles had commenced a schedule of regular treatments. Through the spring and summer of 2024, Charles had continued working while undergoing treatment. His schedule reduced but his visibility maintained. By autumn, the palace had indicated that treatment was proceeding successfully and that the king's prognosis remained encouraging. The public, relieved by these reassurances, had largely accepted that Charles was managing a serious but controllable condition. But behind the carefully managed public narrative, a different reality was emerging. Routine scans conducted in September and October 2025 had begun showing developments that concerned Charles's oncology team. The cancer had not spread to new sites, which was positive, but the original site was showing signs of resistance to the initial treatment protocol. The cells were adapting, finding ways to survive the interventions that had initially seemed effective. Dr. Michael Ashton, Charles's lead oncologist and a specialist in the specific type of cancer the king was fighting, had recommended additional scans and consultations with colleagues at leading cancer research centers. Through November, Charles had undergone a battery of tests, each one providing more detailed information about how his disease was behaving and what options remained available. The consultations had led to a series of private meetings at Clarence House, where Dr. Ashton and his team presented Charles with increasingly difficult information. The cancer was not responding to the current treatment as they had hoped. More aggressive intervention was possible, but it would come with significant side effects that would impact Charles's ability to maintain his current level of activity. The options presented were stark. Charles could continue his current treatment, knowing it was likely to become progressively less effective, buying time but accepting gradual decline. Or he could pursue a more aggressive protocol, combining immunotherapy with targeted radiation, which offered better odds of controlling the disease, but would cause debilitating fatigue, potential cognitive effects during treatment cycles, and visible physical changes the public would inevitably notice. There was also a third option, though Dr. Ashton had presented it with obvious reluctance. Charles could choose to forego further aggressive treatment and focus on palliative care, maximizing quality of life for whatever time remained. This option would likely give him months rather than years, but those months would be relatively comfortable rather than spent battling treatment side effects. Charles had listened to all three options with his characteristic stoicism, asking detailed questions about timelines, success rates, and impact on his ability to fulfill royal duties. He had requested time to consult with his family before making a final decision, and Dr. Ashton had agreed with the understanding that delay itself carried risks. The first person Charles told was William. On December 10th, he had asked his son to join him for a private meeting at Clarence House. No staff, no formal agenda, just father and son discussing the reality neither wanted to confront. Charles had explained the medical situation plainly, not hiding behind euphemism or false optimism. William had listened in silence, his face carefully controlled, but his hands gripping the arms of his chair with visible tension. When Charles finished, William's first question had been immediate and direct. How long? Charles had answered with the honesty his son deserved. With aggressive treatment, 2 to 4 years of functional capacity, perhaps slightly longer, though the quality of that time would decline. Without aggressive treatment, significantly less. The conversation that followed had been one of the most difficult of their relationship. William, facing the reality that his father would die during his own lifetime, had struggled between grief and the institutional responsibility of preparing for kingship. Charles, watching his son process this future, had felt the weight of what he was asking William to carry. Not just the crown, but the burden of watching his father's gradual decline while preparing to replace him. By the end of that meeting, they had reached an understanding. Charles would pursue the aggressive treatment, maximizing the time available to ensure a stable transition. William would begin preparing more intensively for the responsibilities that would fall to him. First, gradually through the transitional regency protocol they had recently established, and eventually through full succession. What Charles had decided that day and what would drive his December 203rd statement was that this process should happen transparently. The British public deserved to understand what was coming. And Charles himself deserved the dignity of facing his mortality honestly rather than maintaining a fiction of recovery that was becoming increasingly impossible to sustain. The conversations that preceded the announcement, the formal medical consultation that would lead to Charles's public statement, took place on December 15th in a private conference room at Clarence House. Present were Charles, Prince William, Princess and Queen Camilla, and Dr. Michael Ashton. Along with 2 other specialists from Charles's oncology team, the atmosphere was heavy with an understanding that this meeting would determine not just Charles's treatment plan, but the monarchy's trajectory for the next several years. Dr. Ashton had prepared a comprehensive presentation complete with scan images and statistical projections, but Charles had requested he dispense with formality and simply explain what they were facing. The doctor's assessment was clinical but compassionate. The cancer had shown definitive progression despite the initial treatment protocol. New imaging revealed that while there was no metastatic spread to distant organs, which remained a positive factor, the primary site had developed resistance mechanisms that made the current therapy increasingly ineffective. The recommended course was clear. A shift to second-line treatment combining immunotherapy agents with precisely targeted radiation. This approach offered the best statistical chance of controlling disease progression, potentially adding 2 to 4 years of what Dr. Ashton termed functional quality time. But he was equally clear about the costs. "Your Majesty," Dr. Ashton had said, addressing Charles with the formality that felt necessary even in this intimate setting. The treatment I am recommending will affect you significantly. Fatigue will be pronounced particularly in the days following each treatment cycle. Cognitive clarity may be intermittently impacted and there will be visible physical changes, hair loss, weight fluctuation, complexion changes that will be impossible to hide from public view. Charles had absorbed this without visible reaction, but William, sitting to his father's left, had felt his throat tighten. The image of his father, visibly weakened and altered by treatment, appearing in public while trying to maintain the dignity of his position, was almost unbearable to contemplate. And had been the first to speak, her voice carrying the pragmatic edge that had characterized her approach to royal duty for over 50 years. What are his chances with this treatment versus without it? Dr. Ashton had responded with careful precision, with aggressive intervention. His Majesty has approximately a 60 to 70% chance of maintaining functional capacity for 2 to 3 years with diminishing but continued capacity for an additional year or two beyond that. Without this intervention, we would be looking at a much shorter timeline measured in months rather than years. The stark mathematics of mortality laid out in survival percentages and timeline projections had filled the room with silence. Finally, Camilla, who had been sitting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, had spoken quietly. "What would you recommend, Dr. Ashton, if this were your own father?" The doctor had met her eyes with obvious empathy. "I would recommend the aggressive protocol, Your Majesty, because it offers the best chance of meaningful time, but I would also ensure he understood that meaningful does not mean easy, and that the choice is ultimately about what quality of life he values most." Charles had made his decision then, though he spent several more minutes asking detailed questions about treatment schedules and side effect management. He would pursue the aggressive protocol, but he would do so with one condition that would become the most controversial aspect of his plan. "I will not hide what this treatment does to me," Charles had said firmly. "I will not ask the palace to create elaborate cover stories or to pretend I am healthier than I am. The British public deserves honesty and I deserve the dignity of facing this openly rather than behind a facade of palace deception." William had understood immediately what his father was proposing and the implications troubled him. "You are talking about announcing not just your treatment but your prognosis that is unprecedented." Charles nodded. "It is. But I have watched my mother work herself literally to death maintaining the fiction of perfect health until she could no longer stand. I will not do that. I will tell the truth, adjust my duties as necessary, and allow the transition to happen with transparency rather than a sudden crisis." And surprisingly had supported this position immediately. He is right. The alternative is months or years of palace spin, media speculation, and eventual breakdown that damages trust in the institution. Better to be honest now and manage the transition with dignity. The conversation had then shifted to the practical question of when and how to make such an announcement. The medical team recommended proceeding with the comprehensive review first to have complete current information before any public statement. That review was scheduled for December 23rd. And Charles made the decision that whatever the results showed, he would share them publicly before Christmas. His reasoning was simple but compelling. If the news was difficult, the public would need time to process it during the holiday period when normal routines were already suspended. Waiting until January would mean announcing bad news just as people returned to work, creating unnecessary anxiety and disruption. As the meeting concluded, Charles had made one request of William that would prove emotionally devastating for his son. "I need you to begin preparing. Truly preparing not for some distant theoretical succession, but for assuming powers within the next 18 to 24 months. The Regency protocol we signed was not theoretical planning. It will be necessary." William had nodded, unable to speak, understanding that his father was asking him to prepare for kingship while Charles was still alive, still present, still king in title, but diminishing in capacity.